Judge Marcus Davis slammed his gavel. "This recording is a forgery," he declared, though sweat glistened on his brow. On the screen, the CEO of TitanTech admitted, "If this gets out, we're finished." The courtroom fell silent. What happened next would shock everyone and change everything. But let's start from the beginning. 17-year-old Liam Keenan sat rigidly at the defendant's table, his shoulders tense, his fingers tightly gripping the edge of the table as though it might anchor him to reality. The grand courtroom loomed around him, its cold marble walls and high ceilings designed to intimidate. Rows of spectators filled the gallery, their eyes drilling into him with a mix of curiosity and judgment. Cameras from national news outlets perched on tripods, their lenses capturing every agonizing moment of his trial. Liam could feel their scrutiny, the weight of a world waiting to see if the whistle-blowing kid would crumble. Across the room, the legal team representing TitanTech exuded confidence. Their tailored suits, crisp notes, and smug grins painted them as the picture of control. At the center of it all sat Judge Marcus Davis, a man whose reputation for siding with corporate giants preceded him. His sharp features and piercing eyes scanned the courtroom with practiced indifference, though his lips curled slightly whenever TitanTech's lawyers spoke. Liam shifted uncomfortably in his seat as his attorney, Melanie Carter, whispered last-minute words of encouragement. "Stay calm," she said, her voice barely audible over the murmurs of the crowd. "The truth is on your side." But even as she spoke, Liam's heart pounded with doubt. Would the truth even matter in a place like this? The trial began with procedural monotony. TitanTech's lead counsel, a man named Richard Vance, methodically laying out the corporation's case. His voice was smooth, confident, and laced with subtle condescension. "Your Honor," Vance began, gesturing toward Liam as though he were an unruly child. "This young man flagrantly violated a legally binding confidentiality agreement. By leaking sensitive information, he caused irreparable harm to one of the nation's most innovative companies." Liam's stomach churned as the lawyer spoke, twisting his words to frame him as a reckless criminal. Vance described TitanTech as a beacon of technological progress and innovation, painting Liam's actions as a betrayal not only to the company, but to the public at large. The narrative was clear. TitanTech was the victim, and Liam was the villain. Finally, it was Liam's turn to speak. His palms were clammy as he stood, his knees feeling like they might buckle beneath him. The courtroom fell silent, save for the faint hum of a camera zooming in on his face. Liam's voice faltered, and he cleared his throat, trying again. "I didn't mean to harm anyone. I just wanted to warn people." His voice cracked as he spoke, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. "Their devices, TitanTech's devices, are dangerous. People have a right to know." Before Liam could say another word, Judge Davis let out a derisive chuckle. It wasn't loud, but it carried through the room like a slap. Liam froze, his eyes wide, as the judge leaned back in his chair, his expression amused. "Dangerous, you say?" Davis repeated, his tone dripping with skepticism. "And I suppose you, a high school intern, are more qualified to assess that than the engineers and scientists at TitanTech?" The judge's comment elicited a ripple of laughter from the gallery, and Liam's cheeks flushed with humiliation. He could feel the burn of dozens of eyes on him, their silent judgment cutting deeper than any words. Judge Davis wasn't finished. He turned to the spectators and gestured toward Liam as though presenting a comedy act. "Ladies and gentlemen, do you hear this? A teenager thinks he knows better than an entire team of professionals." The laughter grew louder, echoing off the courtroom walls. Even the stenographer seemed to hesitate, her fingers hovering over the keys as she struggled to keep up with the mockery unfolding. Liam clenched his fists at his sides, his nails digging into his palms. Every instinct screamed at him to shout, to defend himself, to tell them that he wasn't just some naive kid playing hero. But his voice seemed caught in his throat, trapped by the overwhelming weight of the moment. The humiliation was suffocating. Melanie stood quickly, her chair scraping against the floor as she rose to her client's defense. "Your Honor," she said firmly, her tone edged with barely restrained anger. "With all due respect, my client's concerns are valid and supported by evidence. Mocking him doesn't change that fact." The judge's amused expression hardened, his eyes narrowing as he regarded Melanie. "I suggest you choose your words carefully, Counselor," he said coldly. "This court doesn't take kindly to interruptions." His tone carried a veiled threat, and Melanie reluctantly sat back down, though the fire in her eyes remained. Liam sank into his chair, his heart pounding in his chest. The room around him seemed to close in, the walls pressing tighter and tighter. Every laugh, every whisper from the spectators felt like a knife in his back. He had come here hoping for justice, but it was clear that this courtroom was anything but impartial. As the proceedings continued, Liam's humiliation lingered, gnawing at his resolve. The TitanTech lawyers spoke at length about confidentiality agreements and financial damages, their words precise and rehearsed. They painted a picture of a corporation wronged, their trust betrayed by a reckless, ungrateful teenager. Each word was another blow, further cementing the narrative that Liam was nothing more than a child who had made a colossal mistake. But deep down, beneath the shame and fear, a flicker of anger began to burn. This wasn't just about him. It wasn't about TitanTech's reputation or their bottom line. This was about the people who would be hurt if the truth stayed buried. Liam clenched his fists again, this time not out of fear but determination. He wouldn't let them silence him, not here, not now. Melanie Carter stood tall, her voice cutting through the echoes of fading laughter like a blade. "Your Honor, my client has irrefutable evidence that TitanTech's devices are a danger to public safety," she stated, her tone unwavering. "This isn't just about my client. The people have a right to know when their lives are being put at risk." Judge Marcus Davis barely spared her a glance as he leaned back in his oversized chair, the gavel resting idly in his hand like a weapon of unchecked authority. He exhaled audibly, a gesture of dismissal as much as exhaustion, and fixed Melanie with a cold, condescending gaze. "Counselor," he said, drawing out the word, "this trial is not, and I repeat, not, about public safety. We are here to determine whether your client violated a legally binding confidentiality agreement. Keep your arguments relevant." The corporate lawyers seated at the opposite table exchanged knowing smirks, their confidence palpable. One of them, Richard Vance, casually adjusted his tie and scribbled something on his notepad, clearly unperturbed. They knew the judge was on their side, and it showed in every nonchalant movement. The weight of their advantage hung heavy in the air. In the gallery, murmurs began to rise, soft but insistent, like the hum of distant machinery. Whispers passed from row to row, carrying words like biased and rigged. A few onlookers folded their arms and shook their heads, their expressions etched with disdain. Even those who had entered the courtroom impartial were beginning to feel the unmistakable tilt of the scales. At the defendant's table, Liam sat frozen, his hands gripping the edges of his chair as though it were the only thing tethering him to reality. His face, still red from the earlier humiliation, was now pale with resignation. He leaned toward Melanie, his voice barely a whisper. "They've already decided I'm guilty," he said, his words trembling with a mix of fear and frustration. Melanie shot him a quick glance, her eyes filled with determination. "Not if I have anything to say about it," she replied softly, before turning her attention back to the judge. Her knuckles whitened as she gripped the edges of her legal pad. The deck was stacked against her, and she knew it, but she wasn't about to back down. "Your Honor," she began again, her tone more forceful this time, The evidence I'm referring to is directly tied to my client's actions. Liam felt compelled to act because TitanTech's negligence put lives at risk. If we ignore that context, we're not just failing my client, we're failing the public. Judge Davis sighed heavily, the sound resonating like a hammer falling on steel. "Miss Carter, this is not a courtroom for moral grandstanding," he said, his voice dripping with impatience. "If you can't stick to the matter at hand, I will have no choice but to cut this short." The tension in the room thickened, stifling and oppressive. Melanie pressed her lips together, holding back the retort that was burning on the tip of her tongue. She knew she couldn't afford to antagonize the judge any further, not when the outcome of the case was already so precarious. Across the room, Richard Vance rose to his feet, the epitome of corporate composure. He adjusted his suit jacket and addressed the judge with a confident nod. "Your Honor, if I may," he began, his tone smooth and polished. "Ms. Carter's attempts to shift the narrative are both irrelevant and inappropriate. TitanTech's reputation is being unfairly tarnished by these baseless accusations. This case is, at its core, about a breach of trust, nothing more." The gallery fell silent as his words hung in the air, their weight amplified by the sheer authority he exuded. Melanie's jaw tightened, her nails digging into the paper in front of her. She could feel the walls closing in, the suffocating sense of inevitability creeping over her. Liam, sitting beside her, clenched his fists under the table. His breath came in shallow bursts as he tried to steady himself, but the words of the corporate lawyer echoed in his mind like a taunt. Breach of trust. The phrase felt like a dagger twisting in his chest. All he had wanted was to do the right thing, to protect people from harm, and now he was being vilified for it. Judge Davis nodded at Vance, his expression neutral but his body language betraying a subtle approval. "Well said, Mr. Vance," he remarked before turning back to Melanie. "Ms. Carter, unless you have something concrete to present, I suggest we move on." Melanie inhaled deeply, her mind racing. She had concrete evidence, damning evidence, but she knew that no matter how solid her case, it would be dismissed under the guise of irrelevance. The judge's biases were painfully clear, and the corporate lawyers were playing the game masterfully. In the gallery, a woman whispered loudly enough to draw attention. "This is a farce," she said, shaking her head. A man beside her nodded in agreement. The room was restless, the sense of injustice palpable. Even those with no personal stake in the case could feel the imbalance. Melanie straightened her shoulders and stepped forward again, her voice steady despite the chaos around her. "Your Honor, my client acted out of a sense of duty to the public. If the court won't consider that, then we're not pursuing justice. We're just protecting power." The words hung in the air for a moment, charged with defiance. Judge Davis's eyes narrowed, his jaw tightening. "Ms. Carter," he said slowly, his tone like ice, "I will remind you one last time to stay on topic. This is my courtroom, and I will not tolerate theatrics." Melanie's heart sank, but her resolve remained unbroken. She stepped back, her mind already calculating her next move. The odds were against them, but she wasn't about to let Liam be silenced without a fight. As the session continued, the atmosphere in the room grew heavier, the battle lines more clearly drawn. Liam glanced at Melanie, his eyes filled with both gratitude and fear. Whatever came next, he knew she was his only hope. Melanie Carter stood at the center of the courtroom, holding a folder in her hands. Her voice, calm but laced with urgency, cut through the tense silence. "Your Honor, I present internal emails from TitanTech executives, acknowledging the known risks of their technology." Her words hung in the air, drawing the attention of everyone in the room. The gallery, which had been a low murmur of whispers moments ago, fell completely silent. With deliberate movements, Melanie placed the documents on the evidence table, making sure the jury and spectators could see the weight of what she held. These are communications between high-ranking members of TitanTech, she continued. In their own words, they admit the dangers their devices pose. I request that these emails be entered into evidence. The opposing counsel, Richard Vance, immediately rose from his seat, his tone dripping with feigned outrage. Objection, Your Honor. These documents are irrelevant to the charges being discussed. They serve no purpose but to distract the court with baseless fear-mongering. Judge Marcus Davis raised a hand to silence both sides and adjusted his glasses, his eyes narrowing at the documents before him. Let's see them, he said, his tone begrudging, though his posture betrayed his disinterest. The bailiff carried the emails to the bench, where Marcus leaned back in his chair, reading the top page with a carefully controlled expression. Melanie took the opportunity to address the jury, her voice steady and measured. These emails clearly show that TitanTech knew about the risks associated with their devices. They chose to ignore the warnings for the sake of profit, putting the public in harm's way. My client, Liam Keenan, acted as any responsible citizen would. He sounded the alarm when no one else would. Gasps rippled through the courtroom as the contents of one particular email were revealed. A senior executive had written, "If this gets out, we're done for." The weight of those words was undeniable, a damning admission that reverberated through the room. Liam, sitting at the defendant's table, glanced nervously at Melanie, a flicker of hope breaking through his otherwise tense demeanor. But Judge Davis barely blinked. He placed the papers down with deliberate care, his expression hardening. "This evidence," he declared, his voice firm and dismissive, "is irrelevant. Let's stick to the case at hand, which is whether or not Mr. Keenan violated his confidentiality agreement." The room erupted into whispers again, this time louder and tinged with disbelief. The gallery's frustration was palpable. People shook their heads, muttered to each other, and exchanged disapproving looks. Even some jurors seemed unsettled, glancing between each other as if questioning the judge's decision. Liam could feel his heart pounding in his chest. He leaned forward, gripping the edge of the table, his knuckles white. A surge of anger and desperation rose within him. Before Melanie could stop him, he stood up, his voice trembling but filled with emotion. "How can you ignore the truth?" he demanded, his eyes locked on the judge. "Aren't judges supposed to care about justice? People are being hurt, and you're just going to let them get away with it?" A collective gasp swept through the courtroom. Melanie's eyes widened in alarm, and she reached for Liam's arm, trying to pull him back into his seat. "Liam, sit down," she whispered urgently, but he didn't budge. Judge Marcus Davis's face darkened. He slammed his gavel down with enough force to make everyone flinch. "Order! Order in the court!" he barked, his voice booming over the noise. He pointed a stern finger at Liam. "One more outburst, Mr. Keenan, and I will hold you in contempt of court. Do you understand me?" The room fell silent again, the weight of the judge's words settling over everyone like a suffocating blanket. Liam slowly sat back down, his face flushed and his hands trembling. Melanie leaned toward him, her voice low and urgent. "Don't do that again," she warned. "You're only making things worse." Liam didn't respond. His jaw was clenched tightly, and his gaze remained fixed on the table in front of him. Inside, he was fuming. How could they just brush aside evidence that so clearly showed the truth? How could a courtroom, a place meant to uphold justice, be so blind to what was right in front of them? Richard Vance smirked from across the room, clearly enjoying the spectacle. He stood once more, addressing the judge with a confident tone. "Your Honor, I believe this only further demonstrates the defense's attempt to divert attention from the real issue here, my client's broken trust and financial losses. The defendant's emotional outbursts should not cloud the facts." Judge Davis nodded, his expression stern but approving. "You're correct, Mr. Vance. Let's proceed without any more interruptions." He glanced pointedly at Melanie and Liam, as if daring them to step out of line again. Melanie took a deep breath, her mind racing. She knew the odds were stacked against them, but the judge's blatant dismissal of such crucial evidence was a bitter pill to swallow. She couldn't shake the feeling that no matter what she presented, the system was rigged to protect TitanTech. The tension in the room was almost unbearable. Liam sat motionless, his hands still trembling as he tried to contain the storm of emotions swirling inside him. Across the gallery, spectators exchanged uneasy glances, their faith in the fairness of the trial visibly shaken. The room felt heavy, charged with unspoken frustration and disbelief. Melanie straightened her papers, her face a mask of composure despite the turmoil within. She knew she couldn't let this setback rattle her. If the judge wanted to ignore the truth, she would find another way to make it impossible to deny. For now, though, she had to play his game. The fight was far from over. Melanie Carter rose from her seat, her expression sharp and focused, the weight of the moment pressing heavily on her shoulders. She turned toward the judge, her voice calm but firm. "Your Honor, I would like to call a former TitanTech employee to the stand. His testimony will provide critical insight into the company's internal practices." The courtroom murmured as the witness, a middle-aged man with a hunched posture and a nervous demeanor, slowly made his way to the stand. His hands trembled slightly as he adjusted his tie, his eyes darting between Melanie and the row of TitanTech lawyers who watched him with thinly veiled contempt. He took the oath with a shaky voice, then sat down, glancing anxiously at the judge. "Please state your name and former position at TitanTech for the record," Melanie began, her tone steady, giving the man a small nod of encouragement. "My name is Daniel Brooks," he replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "I was a senior safety engineer at TitanTech for 7 years." Melanie approached the stand, her heels clicking softly against the floor. "Mr. Brooks, can you tell the court about the internal safety warnings you and your team issued regarding TitanTech's latest devices?" Daniel hesitated, swallowing hard. The room seemed to hold its collective breath, every spectator leaning in slightly. Even the jury, who had been stifling yawns earlier, now sat upright, their eyes fixed on the witness. We identified several design flaws," Daniel began, his voice shaking. "Flaws that could lead to serious malfunctions. We submitted detailed reports to management, urging them to delay the product launch until the issues were addressed." He paused, his hands gripping the edge of the witness stand. "But they ignored us. They said fixing the problems would cost too much and delay their release schedule." A ripple of shock ran through the gallery. Someone in the back muttered, "Unbelievable," while others exchanged incredulous looks. The jury shifted uncomfortably in their seats, some glancing toward the TitanTech lawyers, whose expressions remained stoic but tense. Melanie pressed forward. "To be clear, Mr. Brooks, you're saying that TitanTech knowingly released a dangerous product to the public despite internal warnings?" "Yes," Daniel admitted, his voice firmer now, as though the weight of his confession had given him courage. "They knew, and they released it anyway." The audience gasped audibly, the tension in the room palpable. Melanie took a step back, letting the weight of his words sink in. She could see the expressions of disbelief and anger spreading through the gallery. Even the stenographer hesitated for a moment, glancing up from her machine. But before Melanie could proceed, Judge Marcus Davis raised a hand, his voice cutting through the murmurs like a knife. "That's enough," he said sharply, his tone carrying an edge of irritation. He turned to Melanie, his expression cold. "Unless this witness can directly prove Mr. Keenan's innocence, this testimony is irrelevant to the matter at hand." The gallery erupted into frustrated whispers. "What is he talking about?" someone said aloud. "This is proof the kid was right." Another person chimed in. "This is a joke. He's protecting the corporation." The murmurs grew louder, and Marcus slammed his gavel, silencing the room. This trial is about a breach of confidentiality, not the inner workings of TitanTech. The judge continued, his tone authoritative. Stay focused on the case at hand, Ms. Carter. Melanie's jaw tightened, but she maintained her composure. Your Honor, this testimony establishes the motive behind my client's actions. It demonstrates that his decision to disclose information was driven by concern for public safety, not personal gain. Ms. Carter, Marcus interrupted, his voice low and dangerous. I will not entertain further attempts to derail this trial. Consider this your final warning. Melanie clenched her fists at her sides, swallowing the retort that burned in her throat. She returned to the defense table, her frustration barely contained. Liam sat beside her, his face pale but his eyes blazing with anger. How can he just dismiss that? He whispered. It's the truth. Melanie placed a calming hand on his shoulder. We'll get there, she said quietly, though the strain in her voice betrayed her own doubts. Outside the courtroom, the atmosphere was a stark contrast to the tense silence within. Protesters lined the streets, their signs and banners waving in the air. Messages like, Justice for Liam and Stop Corporate Greed were scrawled in bold letters, their colors vibrant against the gray of the courthouse steps. The chants of the crowd were rhythmic and relentless. What do we want? Justice. When do we want it? Now! The protests had started small, a few concerned citizens gathering in support of Liam. But as the trial gained traction in the media, the movement had grown exponentially. Social media was flooded with clips from the courtroom, with millions tuning in to live streams of the proceedings. The hashtag Justice for Liam was trending nationwide, and public opinion was shifting rapidly against TitanTech. Inside the courtroom, the sounds of the protests were faint but constant, a distant reminder that the world was watching. The TitanTech lawyers glanced uneasily at each other, the first cracks in their confident facade beginning to show. Even Judge Marcus seemed distracted, his eyes flickering toward the windows where the banners and signs were faintly visible. Melanie noticed the shift and felt a small surge of hope. The fight was far from over, but the public outcry was growing louder with each passing moment. She turned her attention back to Liam, who sat with his head down, his fists clenched tightly on his lap. This isn't over, she whispered to him, her voice firm. They're trying to bury the truth, but we're not going to let them. Not now, not ever. Liam looked up at her, the fire in his eyes reigniting. For the first time since the trial began, he allowed himself to believe that they might still have a chance. Outside, the chants of the crowd grew louder, their voices carrying the promise of justice. Melanie Carter stood resolutely before the court, papers in hand, her voice cutting through the charged air of the courtroom. Your Honor, I am filing a formal motion to recuse Judge Marcus Davis from this case, she declared, her words echoing across the silent room. We have uncovered significant evidence that suggests a financial relationship between the judge and TitanTech, which calls into question the impartiality of these proceedings. The gallery erupted into murmurs, spectators craning their necks to catch a glimpse of the judge's reaction. Judge Marcus's expression hardened, his lips pressing into a thin line. He tapped his gavel sharply. Order! He barked, silencing the crowd. His tone was icy as he addressed Melanie. Ms. Carter, I trust you have substantial proof to support such a serious accusation. Melanie's shoulders remained square, her composure unshaken. Indeed, Your Honor, she replied, handing the papers to the bailiff. Bank statements show multiple deposits into your campaign fund from entities closely tied to TitanTech. These contributions were made during the same period when my client was accused and arrested, raising legitimate concerns about conflict of interest. The gallery buzzed again, voices growing louder. The words corruption and bias floated through the air like sparks threatening to ignite a wildfire. Judge Marcus glanced at the documents briefly before slamming his gavel again. This motion is denied, he announced firmly, his voice cutting through the chaos. "There is no concrete evidence to suggest impropriety, and this courtroom will not tolerate baseless distractions." The denial only fueled the whispers of outrage among the spectators. A few jurors exchanged uneasy glances, and Melanie could see the doubt flicker across their faces. She exhaled slowly, her mind racing. The motion had failed, but the seed of suspicion was now firmly planted in the room. Across the courtroom, Richard Vance, the lead counsel for TitanTech, rose with a confident smirk. He adjusted his tie and stepped forward, holding a file in his hand. "Your Honor," he began smoothly, "in light of Ms. Carter's theatrics, we would like to submit additional evidence that speaks directly to Mr. Keenan's motivations." Vance placed the file on the evidence table and opened it with deliberate precision. The gallery leaned forward, their collective attention drawn to his every move. "This is a series of emails and bank transactions," Vance explained, his tone exuding manufactured sincerity. "It shows that Mr. Keenan received payments from third parties shortly after leaking TitanTech's confidential information. This evidence strongly suggests that his actions were financially motivated rather than altruistic." Liam's face went pale as he heard the accusation, his heart pounding in his chest. "That's not true," he whispered to Melanie, panic evident in his voice. "I never took money from anyone." Melanie's jaw tightened. She could feel the weight of the courtroom's gaze on them. "Don't worry," she whispered back. "We'll expose this for what it is, a fabrication." Judge Marcus examined the documents with an expression of feigned neutrality. "This evidence is admissible," he declared, handing the papers back to the bailiff. His words landed like a hammer, the implication of guilt hanging in the air. Melanie stood immediately, her voice steady but firm. "Your Honor, we intend to challenge the authenticity of these documents. They are nothing more than an attempt to smear my client's character and distract from the real issues at hand." Vance raised an eyebrow, his smirk deepening. "The evidence speaks for itself, Counselor. Perhaps you should focus on explaining your client's actions rather than attacking the credibility of this evidence." The tension in the room was palpable. The spectators murmured in hushed tones, torn between shock at the accusation and skepticism of its timing. Melanie ignored Vance's taunt and turned her attention to the next step. If TitanTech wanted to play dirty, she would meet them head-on. When the court reconvened after a short recess, Melanie called her next witness, TitanTech's own CEO, Charles Stanton. The man entered the courtroom with the air of a seasoned executive, his expensive suit and carefully styled hair exuding confidence. But as he sat on the witness stand, Melanie noticed the slight twitch in his jaw and the way his hands gripped the edges of the chair just a bit too tightly. "Mr. Stanton," Melanie began, pacing slowly in front of the witness stand, "as the CEO of TitanTech, you are responsible for overseeing all major decisions within the company, correct?" "Correct," Stanton replied curtly, his tone clipped. "And would you agree that ensuring the safety of your products is one of those responsibilities?" she asked, her voice calm but piercing. "Of course," he replied, shifting slightly in his seat. "TitanTech is committed to the highest standards of safety." Melanie paused, letting his words hang in the air. Then, with a sharp pivot, she approached the evidence table. "Mr. Stanton, are you familiar with these internal emails from your executives?" She held up the documents Daniel Brooks had testified about earlier, the ones detailing safety warnings that were ignored. Stanton's composure faltered for a brief moment. His eyes flicked to the papers, then to Melanie. Those emails were taken out of context," he said quickly. "They don't represent the full picture." Melanie stepped closer, her voice growing sharper. "Then perhaps you can provide the full picture, Mr. Stanton. Were there additional documents discussing these safety risks? And if so, why haven't they been disclosed to the court?" Stanton hesitated, beads of sweat forming on his forehead. His jaw tightened, and he glanced toward TitanTech's legal team, who sat motionless, their expressions unreadable. The silence in the courtroom stretched unbearably long before Stanton finally spoke. "There are internal documents," he admitted, his voice barely audible. "But they're confidential. They're not relevant to this case." The courtroom froze. His words hung in the air like a bomb waiting to explode. The gallery erupted into gasps and murmurs, and even the jurors sat up straighter, their expressions a mix of shock and disbelief. Melanie's eyes locked onto Stanton's. "Internal documents proving your company's negligence and deliberate disregard for safety? I'd say that's very relevant to this case, Mr. Stanton." Judge Marcus's gavel came down hard, his voice booming. "Order! Order in the court!" But it was too late. Stanton's accidental admission had set off a firestorm, and the courtroom buzzed with the weight of the revelation. Melanie stepped back, her heart pounding. The crack in TitanTech's armor was now visible. It wasn't enough to win the case yet, but it was the kind of breakthrough that could shift the momentum in their favor. She caught Liam's eye and saw the faintest glimmer of hope in his expression. The fight wasn't over, not by a long shot. Melanie Carter stepped forward, her voice sharp and resolute, cutting through the charged silence in the courtroom. "Your Honor," she began, her tone unwavering, "I demand that the secret documents mentioned by Mr. Stanton be submitted as evidence." She gestured toward the witness stand, where the TitanTech CEO sat, visibly shaken. "These documents are critical to understanding the motivations behind my client's actions and the lengths to which TitanTech has gone to conceal the truth." The courtroom buzzed with whispers, the audience leaning in with a collective sense of anticipation. Everyone knew this was a pivotal moment, a chance for the defense to crack open the carefully constructed facade of TitanTech's innocence. Even the jurors exchanged uncertain glances, their curiosity piqued by Melanie's bold request. Judge Marcus Davis, however, remained unfazed. He leaned back in his chair, the picture of judicial authority, and let out a heavy sigh. "Ms. Carter," he said, his voice steady but dismissive, "this trial is not about TitanTech's internal documents. It's about whether your client violated his confidentiality agreement. These so-called secret documents are irrelevant to the matter at hand and will not be admitted into evidence." The gallery erupted into murmurs of disbelief. Spectators shook their heads and exchanged incredulous looks, their frustration bubbling to the surface. "How can he ignore this?" Someone whispered loudly enough to be heard. The tension in the room thickened, and all eyes turned to Melanie, waiting to see how she would respond. Melanie didn't flinch. She took a deep breath and stepped closer to the judge's bench, her voice rising with controlled intensity. "Your Honor, with all due respect, this court has a duty to the truth. If TitanTech has documents that prove my client acted out of a moral obligation to protect the public, then those documents are not just relevant, they're essential." Judge Marcus narrowed his eyes, his patience clearly wearing thin. "Ms. Carter," he said, his tone sharp, "I will remind you once again to stick to the issue at hand. This courtroom is not the place for grandstanding." But Melanie wasn't backing down. She straightened her shoulders, her gaze locked on the judge. "Grandstanding?" she repeated, her voice cutting through the murmurs in the gallery. "Your Honor, is this courtroom here to protect the powerful, or is it here to deliver justice?" Gasps rippled through the room, the tension reaching a breaking point. The spectators froze, their eyes fixed on Melanie, who stood defiantly in the face of the judge's authority. Even the stenographer paused for a moment, her fingers hovering over the keys as if she needed to process what had just been said. Judge Marcus's face darkened, his jaw tightening as he leaned forward. "Ms. Carter," he began, his voice low and menacing, "I will not tolerate—" Before he could finish, Liam Keenan rose from his seat. His hands trembled, but his voice, though unsteady, carried the weight of his conviction. "The people deserve the truth," he said, his words breaking the heavy silence. He looked directly at the judge, his voice growing stronger with every word. Even if it comes from someone like me, a kid who just wanted to do the right thing. The room fell completely silent. For a moment it seemed as though even the walls of the grand courtroom were holding their breath. All eyes turned to Liam, his defiance radiating through the space. The cameras, positioned discreetly in the corners of the room, zoomed in on his face, capturing the raw emotion in his expression. From the gallery, someone whispered, "He's right," and others nodded in agreement. The atmosphere shifted, the collective frustration of the spectators turning into quiet admiration for the young man who dared to speak up against overwhelming odds. Judge Marcus's gavel came down hard, the sharp crack echoing through the room. "Order! Order in the court!" he shouted, his voice struggling to regain control of the situation. He pointed a stern finger at Liam. "Mr. Keenan, you are out of line. One more outburst, and I will hold you in contempt of court." Liam sat back down, his chest rising and falling as he tried to steady his breathing. But the damage, or perhaps the progress, had already been done. The courtroom felt different now, as though the balance of power had shifted, however slightly. The gallery, once murmuring with skepticism, now seemed to lean toward Liam and Melanie, their sympathy growing with every passing moment. Melanie, still standing, glanced toward the cameras. She knew the significance of what had just happened. The footage of Liam's bold declaration would reach far beyond the walls of this courtroom. It would be broadcast to millions of people across the country, sparking conversations and perhaps igniting a movement. She turned back to the judge, her voice steady but filled with quiet resolve. "Your Honor," she said, "my client's actions were not those of a criminal, but of someone who understood the true cost of silence. If this court refuses to consider the evidence that proves his motives, then it is failing not just him, but every person who looks to our justice system for fairness." The judge didn't respond immediately. He sat back in his chair, his expression unreadable, as the murmurs in the gallery resumed. TitanTech's legal team shifted uncomfortably, their earlier confidence now tinged with unease. They had watched the tide begin to turn, and though they wouldn't admit it, they could feel the momentum slipping from their grasp. The session adjourned moments later, but the courtroom remained abuzz with energy. As people filed out, reporters scrambled to get statements, and the chants of protesters outside grew louder. The footage of Liam's stand quickly spread online, dominating news cycles and social media feeds. Millions watched as the young whistleblower challenged the system, his words resonating with people far beyond the courtroom. Inside, Melanie sat beside Liam, her hand resting briefly on his shoulder. "You did good, Liam," she said softly. "This isn't over, but you made them listen." Liam nodded, his expression a mix of exhaustion and determination. He knew the fight was far from over, but for the first time, he felt like they had a chance. Outside, the world was watching, and that, he realized, was their greatest weapon. The public outrage was impossible to ignore. Across the nation, people demanded accountability, not just from TitanTech, but from the judicial system itself. Protests swelled outside the courthouse, spilling into nearby streets. Chants of "Justice for Liam" echoed through the air, amplified by the relentless coverage of every development on news networks and social media. Petitions demanding an impartial trial amassed millions of signatures in a matter of days, and politicians, sensing the shift in public sentiment, began to weigh in. The pressure mounted to a boiling point, and finally, the decision came down. The case was reassigned to an impartial judge, Evelyn Hartwell. Judge Hartwell's reputation preceded her. Known for her integrity and refusal to bow to outside influence, she brought a no-nonsense energy to the courtroom. From the moment she entered, the atmosphere changed. There were no smirks from the TitanTech legal team this time. The gallery sat up straighter. The protesters outside cheered, and even Liam, seated beside Melanie, felt a flicker of hope. For the first time, it seemed like the trial would be fair. "Let me make one thing clear," Judge Hartwell began, her voice sharp and commanding. "This courtroom will not tolerate bias, obfuscation, or games. We are here to examine the facts, and the facts alone. Is that understood?" A murmur of agreement rippled through the room, though TitanTech's lawyers exchanged uneasy glances. Richard Vance, their lead counsel, nodded stiffly. "Understood, Your Honor." Melanie wasted no time. "Your Honor, I am formally requesting the admission of the internal documents referenced during Mr. Stanton's testimony," she said, rising from her seat. Her tone was firm, but there was an undercurrent of determination that hadn't been present under Judge Marcus's watch. "These documents are critical to understanding the motives behind my client's actions and the truth about TitanTech's practices." Judge Hartwell nodded. "Submit them." The TitanTech legal team immediately stood, their objections ready. "Your Honor," Vance began, his voice smooth but tense, "these documents are confidential and irrelevant to the charges against Mr. Keenan." Judge Hartwell cut him off with a single raised hand. "I've read the preliminary arguments regarding these documents. If they shed light on TitanTech's internal practices and their connection to this case, they are highly relevant. Your objection is overruled." The gallery erupted into quiet cheers and murmurs of approval, quickly silenced by Hartwell's gavel. "Order," she said sharply, though there was a flicker of satisfaction in her eyes. She turned to Melanie. "You may proceed." Melanie approached the evidence table, placing the documents before the jury. "These emails, financial records, and internal memos paint a clear picture of TitanTech's actions," she said, addressing the room. "They reveal a pattern of negligence, deliberate cover-ups, and a willingness to endanger lives for the sake of profit." The documents were displayed on a large screen, their contents sending shockwaves through the courtroom. Emails from top executives revealed chilling statements. "We can't afford a delay, even if it means cutting safety checks." Another memo outlined the costs of addressing known design flaws, concluding with the words, "Proceed as planned. We'll deal with complaints later." Gasps filled the room as the jury leaned in, their eyes scanning the damning evidence. One document stood out above the rest, a detailed report from the safety department, warning of catastrophic risks if specific components failed. The report had been signed off by senior management with a single note scribbled at the bottom, "Do not share externally." Melanie stepped back, allowing the weight of the evidence to settle over the room. "This," she said, her voice unwavering, "is what my client sought to expose. This is why he acted, not for personal gain, but because he believed that the lives of millions were worth more than TitanTech's bottom line." Richard Vance scrambled to regain control, rising from his seat. "Your Honor, the defense is attempting to vilify my client's company without addressing the charges against Mr. Keenan." Judge Hartwell raised her gavel. "Mr. Vance, the actions of TitanTech are directly tied to the motivations of Mr. Keenan. Sit down." Vance sat, visibly rattled. For the first time, the courtroom felt like it was slipping from his grasp. The confidence he'd exuded throughout the trial was replaced by thinly veiled panic. As the proceedings continued, the truth became impossible to deny. Expert witnesses corroborated the authenticity of the documents, while former employees testified about a culture of silence and intimidation within TitanTech. The evidence against the company piled higher with each passing hour, and the defense's attempts to discredit Liam fell flat. By the time the closing arguments were made, the courtroom was electric with anticipation. Melanie stood before the jury, her voice steady and impassioned. "Liam Keenan is not a criminal," she said. "He is a young man who risked everything to do what was right. The evidence has shown us the truth. TitanTech knowingly endangered the public, and they sought to silence anyone who stood in their way. But justice is not about silencing the brave. It's about holding the powerful accountable. The jury deliberated for hours, though the outcome seemed clear to everyone in the room. When they returned, the verdict was announced. Liam Keenan was declared not guilty. The gallery erupted into cheers, tears streaming down the faces of those who had supported him from the beginning. But the case didn't end there. Judge Hartwell announced that the evidence presented during the trial would be forwarded to federal authorities for further investigation. TitanTech now faced criminal charges, and their CEO, Charles Stanton, was placed under immediate scrutiny. The courtroom buzzed with the realization that this trial was only the beginning of a larger reckoning. As for Judge Marcus Davis, his ties to TitanTech couldn't be ignored. The judiciary launched an internal investigation into his conduct, and he was placed on indefinite suspension. The man who had once dismissed Liam's pleas with a smirk now found himself under the same microscope he had wielded so carelessly. Liam sat in stunned silence as the courtroom emptied around him. Melanie placed a hand on his shoulder, her smile soft but triumphant. "It's over," she said. "You did it." Liam nodded, the weight of the trial finally lifting. Outside, the chants of protesters turned to cheers, their voices a testament to the power of truth. For the first time in weeks, Liam felt something he thought he'd lost forever: hope. The courthouse doors swung open and Liam Keenan stepped out into the blinding afternoon sun. For a moment, he paused at the top of the grand marble steps, his heart pounding as the roar of the crowd hit him like a wave. Hundreds of protesters, supporters, and onlookers had gathered outside, their signs raised high, their voices united in chants of triumph. Reporters surged forward, microphones and cameras aimed directly at him, eager to capture the first words of the teenager who had just taken on one of the most powerful corporations in the country, and won. Liam glanced over his shoulder at Melanie Carter, who stood just behind him, her face lit with a mixture of pride and exhaustion. She gave him a small nod, silently encouraging him to take the next step. He swallowed hard, forcing down the knot of nerves in his throat. This wasn't the time to falter. The eyes of a nation were on him now. Taking a deep breath, Liam stepped to the microphone stand that had been hastily set up at the base of the courthouse steps. The crowd fell silent, their collective anticipation hanging heavy in the air. Camera flashes lit up his face, but he barely noticed. His focus was on the moment, on the words that needed to be said. "Today," he began, his voice steady despite the trembling in his hands, "we proved that the truth is more powerful than money, lies, or intimidation. This case wasn't just about me. It was about standing up to a system that too often silences those who speak out and protects those who abuse their power." The crowd erupted into cheers, but Liam raised a hand, urging them to quiet down. He wasn't finished yet. He glanced at the reporters, their pens poised and ready, then back at the sea of faces before him. Some were cheering, some were crying, but all of them were listening, truly listening. "Justice," Liam continued, his voice growing stronger, "doesn't belong to the rich or the powerful. It belongs to everyone. No matter how young or small you think you are, your voice matters. And when you see something wrong, when you know people are being hurt, you have a choice. You can stay silent, or you can stand up and fight. I chose to fight." His words hung in the air, charged with emotion. For a moment, the crowd was silent, as though they were collectively absorbing the gravity of what he had said. Then, almost in unison, the cheers began again, louder this time, echoing through the city streets. Signs with slogans like "Truth Wins" and "Whistleblowers are Heroes" were thrust into the air, their messages bold against the clear blue sky. Among the crowd were people of all ages, some holding up phones to live stream the moment to the millions who couldn't be there in person. The hashtag #JusticeForLiam was already trending worldwide, and Liam's speech would soon be replayed on every major news network. But this wasn't just about the headlines. It was about what his words would mean to the people watching. People who had stayed silent out of fear, who had seen wrongdoing but believed they were too small to make a difference. Liam stepped back from the microphone, his heart still pounding. Reporters shouted questions, their voices blending into an unintelligible cacophony, but he didn't respond. He didn't need to say more. His message had been delivered, and he could feel its impact reverberating around him. As he descended the steps, Melanie fell into step beside him. "You did good," she said softly, her voice barely audible over the noise of the crowd. Liam glanced at her, a small, grateful smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "We did," he replied. "I couldn't have done this without you." The two of them walked through the crowd, which parted like a sea to let them pass. Strangers reached out to shake Liam's hand, to pat him on the back, to thank him for his courage. Some simply stood there, their faces filled with admiration and hope. For them, Liam wasn't just a teenager anymore. He was a symbol of what was possible when one person refused to back down. As they reached the edge of the crowd, Liam noticed a young woman holding a sign that read, "I'm next." She caught his eye and gave him a small nod, her expression resolute. He nodded back, the gesture brief but powerful. It was in that moment that Liam realized what his fight had sparked. This wasn't the end of something. It was the beginning. Across the country, the ripple effects of his case were already being felt. Whistleblowers from all industries began coming forward, inspired by Liam's bravery. Anonymous reports flooded hotlines, exposing corruption, fraud, and negligence in ways that hadn't been seen before. Activists took up his cause, organizing rallies and calling for stronger protections for whistleblowers. For the first time in years, it felt like the tide was turning. The final image of Liam, captured by dozens of cameras, would go on to become iconic. Standing at the edge of the crowd, his head held high, his shoulders squared, he radiated a quiet strength that resonated with millions. Behind him, the courthouse loomed, a reminder of the battle he had just fought. But Liam wasn't looking back. He was looking ahead, toward a future that seemed just a little brighter than it had before. As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the courthouse steps, Liam felt a sense of peace settle over him. The fight had been long, exhausting, and at times overwhelming, but it had been worth it. Because in the end, the truth had prevailed. Justice didn't belong to the rich or the powerful. It belonged to everyone, and Liam Keenan had proved it.